On this. First, you'll find a one-page handout that's simply called the Path to Nazi Genocide Discussion Items. Again, it's alphabetized, so it's probably about 2/3 of the way back. One more, it should be right there. You got it. No, one more. There you go. The Path to Nazi Genocide Discussion Items, and then immediately following that, no, the path, yeah.
Nazi genocide.
And then after that, you'll find 5 copies of a chart. Everybody got me? Yeah, you'll find 5 copies of a chart. And we gave you 5 copies because we're going to use 4 copies in the workshop here, and then 1 copy for you to keep clean if you want to make photocopies of it. Okay? Now, a little bit of background here. For years and years, teachers would contact the museum in D.C. and say, and they'd say one of 2 things. Number 1, I've got a very limited amount of time to teach the Holocaust. Give me something I can use a couple of days. Or teachers would say, I need something to introduce the Holocaust in a very, very structured kind of way. And the museum, over the course of time, eventually, a good friend of mine named Gretchen Skidmore put this film together, The Path to Nazi Genocide. It was released actually in 2013, I think it was. And I would suggest a couple things about this. If, again, you don't have much time, if you got a couple of days, this is an excellent way to do it. It's 38 minutes long. It's divided into 4 sections, and it's a very, very good introduction to the Holocaust. One of the advantages is it's available on the web. So to find it on the web, you simply go to the website of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, www.ushmn.org, and in the upper right-hand column, or in the upper right-hand section of the home page, there's a search function. Just type in the Path to Nazi Genocide, and you'll get this page that I've got up on the screen right now. And if you go down to link number 4, the film is right there. It's also available on YouTube. I know a lot of schools block YouTube, so but you get it right here, and that. We'll talk about the website this afternoon and about using websites in general. But again, this is very, very accessible. It's free, and so forth and so on. The website is divided into 4 sections, and if you look at that first page there, I've given you a very brief overview of each of the 4 sections. And I've also given you the time frames for each of the 4 sections to make it accessible for you in terms of how long each one is. The first section is about 10 minutes, the other section is about 7 or 8 minutes, and the last section is about 12 minutes. So what we're going to do now and again after lunch is we're going to spend some time working on this section by section. So what we're going to do, run this. I think we've got the sound working properly. And what I would like you to do is, again, put yourself in the role of a student, and as you're watching the first section on the aftermath of World War I and the rise of Nazism, just take some notes, write some questions, as if you were a student hearing this for the first time. And then what we'll do is we'll take some time to go back and see what people have created. And hopefully this will give you some ideas about teaching this, and also as other people share, hopefully we can spread some ideas around. So again, whatever you want to put on the notes, questions, comments, points you don't understand, anything like that. Everybody got the idea? Okay. So hopefully we've got the sound working okay, and then I will get out of the way. There's a bit of an introduction to it. The page is also available in several different languages. One thing I should note, and I know many of you will have Spanish-speaking kids, most of the Holocaust Museum website is now available in Spanish. And it's also available in several, parts of it are also available in several other languages. But almost all of it's available in Spanish. So hopefully our connection is good.
Paris, 1900. More than 50 million people from around the world visited the Universal Exposition, a World's Fair intended to promote greater understanding and tolerance among nations, and to celebrate the new century, new inventions, exciting progress.
Is that okay for everybody?
The 20th century began much like our own, with hope that education, science, and technology could create a better, more peaceful world. What followed soon after were two devastating wars. The First World War, from 1914 to 1918, was fought throughout Europe and beyond. It became known as the War to End All Wars. It cast an immense shadow on tens of millions of people. "This is not war," a wounded soldier wrote home. "It is the ending of the world." Half of all Frenchmen aged 20 to 32 at war's outbreak were dead when it was over. More than 1/3 of all German men aged 19 to 22 were killed. Millions of veterans were crippled in body and in spirit. Advances in the technology of killing included the use of poison gas. Under the pressure of unending carnage, governments toppled and great empires dissolved. It was a cataclysm that darkened the world's view of humanity and its future. Winston Churchill said the war left a crippled, broken world.
One of the nice things about this film is it has these intro panels, so it's very easy to find where you are if you want to go back and forth.
The humiliation of Germany's defeat and the peace settlement that followed in 1919 would play an important role in the rise of Nazism and the coming of a Second World War just 20 years later. What shocked so many in Germany about the treaty signed near Paris at the Palace of Versailles was that the victors dictated a future in which Germany was deprived of any significant military power. Germany's territory was reduced by 13%. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for starting the war and to pay heavy reparations. To many, including 30-year-old former Army Corporal Adolf Hitler, it seemed the country had been stabbed in the back, betrayed by subversives at home and by the government who accepted the armistice. In fact, the German military had quietly sought an end to the war it could no longer win in 1918. It cannot be that 2 million Germans should have fallen in vain, Adolf Hitler later wrote. We demand vengeance. Many veterans and other citizens struggled to understand Germany's defeat and the uncertain future. Troops left the bloody battlefields and returned to a bewildering society. A new and unfamiliar democratic form of government, the Weimar Republic, replaced the authoritarian empire and immediately faced daunting challenges. Thousands of Germans waited in lines for work and food in the early 1920s. Middle-class savings were wiped out as severe inflation left the currency worthless. Some burned it for fuel. economic conditions stabilized for a few years. Then the worldwide depression hit in 1929. The German banking system collapsed, and by 1930, unemployment skyrocketed to 22%. In a country plagued by joblessness, embittered by loss of territory, and demoralized by ineffective government, political demonstrations frequently turned violent. Many political parties had their own paramilitary units to attack opponents and intimidate voters. In 1932, 99 people were killed in the streets in 1 month. Right-wing propaganda and demonstrations played on fears of a communist revolution spreading from the Soviet Union. New social problems emerged from the impact of rapid industrialization and the growth of cities. Standards of behavior were changing. Crime was on the rise. Sexual norms were in flux. For the first time, women were working outside the home in large numbers, and the new constitution gave women the right to vote. Germany's fledgling democracy was profoundly tested by the crumbling of old values and fears of what might come next. Adolf Hitler had been undisputed leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, known as Nazis, since 1921. In 1923, he was imprisoned for trying to overthrow the government. His trial brought him fame and followers. He used the jail time to dictate his political ideas in a book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Hitler's ideological goals included territorial expansion, consolidation of a racially pure state, and elimination of the European Jews and other perceived enemies of Germany. He served only a short jail sentence, and after the ban was lifted on his National Socialist Party, Hitler and his followers rejoined the battle in the streets and in the countryside. The Nazi Party recruited, organized, and produced a newspaper to spread its message. While downplaying more extreme Nazi goals, they offered simple solutions to Germany's problems, exploiting people's fears, frustrations, and hopes. In the early 1930s, the frequency of elections was dizzying. So was the number of parties and splinter groups vying for votes. Hitler proved to be a charismatic campaigner and used the latest technology to reach people. The Nazi Party gained broad support, including many in the middle class, intellectuals, civil servants, students, professionals, shopkeepers and clerks ruined by the Depression. But the Nazis never received more than 38% of the vote in a free national election. No party was able to win a clear majority, and without political consensus, successive governments could not effectively govern the nation. Adolf Hitler was not elected to office, and he did not have to seize power. He was offered a deal, just as the Nazis started to lose votes. In January 1933, when the old war hero, President Paul von Hindenburg, invited Hitler to serve as chancellor in a coalition government, the Nazis could hardly believe their luck. The Nazis were revolutionaries who wanted to radically transform Germany. The conservative politicians in the new cabinet didn't like or trust Hitler, but they liked democracy even less, and they saw the leftist parties as a bigger threat. They reached out to the Nazis to help build a majority in parliament. They were confident they could control Hitler. 1 month later, when arson gutted the German parliament building, Hitler and his nationalist coalition partners seized their chance. exploiting widespread fears of a communist uprising. They blamed communists for the fire and declared emergency rule. President Hindenburg signed a decree that suspended all basic civil rights and constitutional protections, providing the basis for arbitrary police actions. The new government's first targets were political opponents. Under the emergency decree, they could be terrorized, beaten, and held indefinitely. Leaders of trade unions and opposition parties were arrested. German authorities sent thousands, including leftist members of parliament, to newly established concentration camps. Despite Nazi terror and brutal suppression of their opponents, many German citizens willingly accepted or actively supported these extreme measures in favor of order and security. Many Germans felt a new hope and confidence in the future of their country, with the prospect of a bold, young, charismatic leader. Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels planned to win over those who were still unconvinced.
Man muss nämlich gut regieren und für eine gute Regierung auch eine gute Propaganda betreiben. Das eine gehört zum anderen. Eine gute Regierung ohne Propaganda kann ebenso wenig bestehen wie eine gute Propaganda ohne eine gute Regierung.
Hitler spoke to the SA, his army of stormtroopers.
Deutschland ist nun erwacht. Die Macht haben wir nun in Deutschland gewonnen. Nun gilt es, das deutsche Volk zu gewinnen.
Now, what I'd like to do is to have a discussion about the film with comments you may have written, questions you may have written. And again, I would suggest this is a nice way to start with students. And again, if you look at the discussion outline there, the segments of these are very nice. The first one is about, including the introduction, is about 12 minutes. And then you have a couple of 6 or 7 minute segments, and then another 12-minute segment. So they're very usable within a class period or two, if indeed you only have a couple of days to do this. And one of the things I would really emphasize here about the film, two things actually. Number one, the accessibility, the fact that it's available on the web, but also the accuracy factor. When we start talking about historical accuracy, when you look at the Holocaust Museum website, everything that goes on this website has been vetted in any number of ways by the historians, legal in terms of copyrights when it comes to photographs and things like that. And that's not always the case. You all know, those of you who are history teachers know, that history books have mistakes, factual mistakes, plain out factual mistakes in many cases. And I think using this really allows you to avoid that problem, because if it's on the museum website, it is accurate, flat out, okay? Okay, so questions you have about this, discussions, things, you know, if you were in a classroom, how might you use it? What points might you pick out or point out to kids, and so forth. And we'll do that. We'll do this with each of the 4 sections. Yeah, Jackie.
Right at the end, they were talking about propaganda, and
Yeah.
that took me back to the beginning of the school year when we did Animal Farm. So
Right,
I'm
okay.
being able to tie that
Good.
all together, and then we've also tied that into North Korea then.
Okay. It's interesting to note, and by the way, one of the things when you do this is because you don't know what your students are going to bring up. You have to be ready to think very quickly. Jeff is shaking his head, yes. You have to really be able to think quickly on your feet, because you don't know what students are going to have, and therefore you don't know what first period is going to do and third period is going to do. So you got to get away from the scripted routine a little bit. It's interesting to note that up until the Nazi era, the word propaganda had a positive connotation. It comes from the Latin to propagate the church, to advance the church. And in fact, in the mid-1920s, there was a little book written, I forget the name of the author now, Eddie, maybe you know, it's about advertising. And it was written by an American who was an advertising agency manager and had the account for like Woolworths or something like that. And he talks about, in this little booklet, I've got it at home someplace, he talks about propaganda, and he simply equates propaganda with what was beginning to become modern advertising. So the fact that, if you use the word propaganda today, we immediately think bad. And that was not the use of the word until Goebbels came along. By the way, Goebbels had a PhD in humanities and literature. Interesting. Okay, anybody else? Come on, take part. Yeah.
So I'm really big on like the big idea questions that kind of like fit into other areas in history. So it's kind of like the step back idea.
Okay,
So
gotcha.
I found a lot of really cool questions that can be like really cool debate questions. So like a few that I found is nationalism normally an excuse for doing horrific acts? So do they use nationalism as an excuse? Kind of like what preventative measures did they have? Should they have been eased into democracy? Can democracy work? And then what role did media play? So kind of like, I like the big idea questions,
Oh, boy,
just
there's
the
some great
conversation
ones there.
questions. Yeah.
That question about should they have been eased into democracy, one of the issues that comes when you look at the Weimar Republic is that Germans had very little experience with any kind of representative democracy. And all of a sudden they're thrown the Weimar Republic, which is a very, very liberal democratic document, the Weimar Constitution. And they had no experience in it, number one. Patty's shaking her head, yes, she's the political scientist here. And number two, because of what happened, they equated it with bad things. I mean, as Americans, we sort of have an intuitive belief in democracy, right? I mean, even given the current political situation, I think we still have it. Hopefully we still have it. Germans didn't have that. They're told this thing democracy, and all of a sudden things go bad, and they equate democracy with the negative. And by the way, it's something that's happened in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union as well.
A good one to have students think about before you even turn it on is like look for ordinary people. Like watch their movements, watch their actions, and think about how those ordinary people turned into, one of those 4 or 5 categories.
Exactly.
And it's interesting because then you can turn it into a writing prompt, and it turns the video into something more than just watching and taking notes. It turns it into how do I, see myself as a soldier or a lawyer, a teacher, a doctor, whatever you see throughout. It's interesting to have them connect to how it looked at I think it's the first 45 seconds or a minute or so where everybody's excited about the World's Fair and things like that, and how it drastically changes within a 2-minute span.
Jeff, a couple of times just talk about groups. Let me make sure we understand. Perpetrators, victims, resistors, bystanders, rescuers. Those are the sort of 5 groups that we talk about. Perpetrators, victims, rescuers, bystanders, resistors. Of those, the only group that didn't have a choice were the victims. The other groups are all groups that you could choose to join or choose to leave and so forth and so on. You had to choose to be a perpetrator. You had to choose to be a resistor and so forth and so on. So those are the 5 sort of groups that we normally discuss.
You get different perspectives when they watch this. It's really interesting because some will pick the perpetrator out the back because it's really the easiest to see. And all of a sudden people are picking, bystanders, like as the children there's children that in that first video where they're standing off to the side just watching with their eyes big, and kids pick kids. And it was interesting because you'll get a different view from what your students want to do.
Yeah, and again, that's where I think, Jeff, I think you'd agree with that's where you get the questions that you never really know where those questions are coming. It makes for some interesting teaching situations, quite frankly. Other things in the film. Either, again, comments like that or specific historical contextual pieces you want to ask about.
One of the things that stuck out to me when Hitler was addressing the army, at the end, not everyone threw their hand up.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was before or after the Night of Long Knives, and might there have been some resentment there?
That wasn't the army, it was the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the stormtroopers. And it would have been before, there were 2 paramilitary groups within the Nazi Party. The SA, the stormtroopers, the brown shirts, and then the black shirts, the SS. And the SS was the elite. It originally began as a protective squad for the Nazi leadership and then evolved. And the SA were the stormtroopers, and they were kind of, for the most part, basically street thugs. And eventually, the SA became sort of an embarrassment to the Nazi party, so Hitler ordered what was called the Night of the Long Knives in, Patty helped me, 1934, something like that. And he ordered the leadership of the SA to be executed, and they disbanded. So this would have been before that. That was probably in 33, maybe early 34. But those are the brown shirts, and the SS is the black shirts, and those are the real. That's really the core of the Nazi leadership later on. And when you get to the camps, and that the SS is really the prime one. The SA is pretty well gone by that time. Again, to be in the SS, you had to be. It was, at least to begin with, it was a very elite organization to be in.
You had to prove your lineage 500 years
You
back.
had to prove your lineage back so many generations, and yeah, and eventually that was even changed. Eventually, there were some Norwegians who joined the SS later on.
And Bosnians.
Was it?
And Bosnians.
Yeah, later on,
Yeah.
much later in the circumstance. But that was the elite Schutzstaffel, the protective squad, literally, as opposed to Sturmabteilung, which was the stormtroopers. But that's an important question to ask: is when does this occur? And again, it's fairly early. And the part where some of them aren't raising their hands, I don't really know, because they were all dedicated members of the party. So I've often wondered about that particular clip as well. It may just have been a quirk. Other things, questions? Yeah.
One thing that I emphasize a lot when I teach it is the Treaty of Versailles and how that.
What grade level?
High school.
U.S. or world?
Kind of both.
Well, okay, yeah. And where?
Homestead High School.
Okay.
And what the purpose of that was the purpose to help Germany and to ensure peace in the future? Or was the purpose to ensure that Germany wouldn't be a problem for them in the future? And then you see that almost immediately when they have political parties, each political party has its own militant group surrounding it. You're seeing that they're not doing it in the way that was intended, and they're certainly not, being guided by a country or a group that had experience in democracy. So again, it gets back to that point. What was the purpose there? They weren't even invited to participate in the conference, so you see the effects of that.
Yeah, if you look at the conference, the German delegates were there, but they were not allowed to do, every day, at the end of every day, they were told this is what happened, and they were eventually, when the war clause guilt was included, and it's way down, if you look at the Versailles Treaty, the war clause group is way down, whatever number is 22 or something like that. They were astounded because when Germany signed the armistice, they didn't think they'd lost. They signed an armistice. And when they get to Versailles and told, you lost. I've got a friend of mine who's a retired teacher from Denver, and we were doing a workshop in Denver one time, and he has this thing that he does, 10 key photographs or something. And he showed this one in the workshop. Pete, what are you doing with this one? And it was these German soldiers coming back to the town from which they were at the end of the war, and they have these kind of plumed, feathered helmets on. And apparently the tradition of the German military was when they came back from a victorious war, they would wear these feathered, plumed helmets. And they thought they'd won, or at least that they hadn't lost. And then when they're told they're lost, that's where you get the idea of the legend of the stab in the back. The idea that Germany wasn't defeated at the front, it was stabbed at the back, and who did the stabbing?
Kaiser Wilhelm.
Oh no, Kaiser's gone by this time. Jews and communists. And in the Nazi ideology, Jews and communists were what? One and the same thing. This was the idea of the so-called legend of the stab in the back. Because the German army was not defeated. It was a stalemate, as you all know from World War I. The war ended with a stalemate. It didn't end. That's one of the reasons why FDR and Churchill early on say what? Unconditional surrender. To avoid what had happened in 1918. Other questions or comments? Come on, guys.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was kind of piggybacking off the Treaty of Versailles. The impact of the economy in the interwar years, I think, is really important to highlight, and the impact that has on Germany.
And I think one of the important points there, and it's mentioned in there, is that during the we all know the economy went bad in the early 1920s. This is where you have the bills, the money being burned and so forth and so on. But what happens to the German economy from around 25 to 28? It stabilized, actually improves. It looks fairly decent. And what happens to the lure of the extreme political parties from both the left and the right from 25 to 28? Goes down. The Nazi Party almost declares bankruptcy, and I think it was 1927. One of the things I would urge you to do here when you look at this, and you may have already done this if you've talked about, if you're teaching particularly world history, not so much in U.S. history, but if you're teaching world, is to talk about the idea of the political spectrum. Political left, political right. Communism on the political left, Nazism and fascism, fascism and Nazism on the political right. And one of the things, if you look at the votes in the German parliament from 1919, 1920 up until 32, you don't have to look at the economic numbers to know how the economy is doing. When the economy does well, where do the votes go? The center parties. When the economy is going bad, where do the votes go?
Extremists.
Both political extremes, the communists and the Nazis. In fact, at several points along the way, the second number of votes nationwide, now again they have a parliamentary system, but the second number of votes nationwide go to the Nazis, the third number of votes go to the communists. So one of the key ideas here to express to students is this idea is that economy does well, center parties. Economy doesn't do well, extreme parties. It's also interesting to note that there were as many as 28 different political parties running at various times. Now think about the chaos of that in trying to get a majority in a parliamentary system. I mean, there are all kinds of things that come into play here that students may not be aware of because they're not part of the American experience. I mean, we have the idea of two political parties. And that's not the case in in many democracies. And again, 28 political parties in the German system as many as 28 political parties in the German system in the 1920s. And Hitler, the first cabinet that Hitler's in, there are 12 cabinet members. How many of them are Nazis? Anybody know? Of the 12? Only 3. And it says in the film, they thought they could control him, and obviously they made a big mistake in judgment. One or two more things. Yeah.
This kind of goes back on, is your name Jeff?
Yeah.
Yeah, what Jeff said about looking for the ordinary citizen. So I just graduated from IU, and one thing that they super emphasize is...
Oh, bless you, IU. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Oh, it's got to be IU.
Yeah, of course.
So
Even
one
though
of the
we
big
can't
things
pour
they
football
focus
league,
on...
that's another
I don't care
circumstance.
about football. It's not even real.
Yeah.
It's just head traumas and, like,
Yeah.
yelling.
But
Where's it going? Oh, about, like, the importance of agency and everything. So my professor was saying that you should focus on all of the people that could have stopped it, or all of the red flags that kept coming up, and how there's other countries that acknowledge that Hitler started, like, stepping over his boundaries, and it was just kind of like, oh, like, we treat him like a little dog. Like, we're like, you just stop that, like, go to your cage. And then it's like, oh, he got out, and now he killed everybody. But, so a big thing is agency, I guess.
Yeah, we'll get a little bit of that will be in the next segment
Yeah.
where we talked about the building of the regime, the fact that there are these warning signs, and that sometimes there's this view that the democracies didn't know what was going on. The democracies knew what was going on. You can look at the newspaper articles from major American newspapers. In fact, the museum has a project going right now where students are invited to research their own local newspapers in terms of what was in the papers about various things during this whole period. And I've never done it here with the local papers, but I'm guessing you could find the articles on Kristallnacht and on the Olympics and all those different kinds of things. And again, there was this idea of, the word appeasement comes in here. Later on, and this will be covered a little bit later on, there are the 4 major aggressive steps: the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the Munich Pact, and then the final takeover of Czechoslovakia before the war begins. The Allies know all that's going on. They're part and party of that going on. It's really not correct to use the Allies. The French and the British know that's going on. And so this warning sign idea comes into play. And you don't want to overdo that, by the way. That can be a little bit simplistic as well. One more thing, and then we'll go to the next segment. Okay, let's go to the next segment on 33 to 36, where the regime is built up. Now, just to give you a couple of lead-ins here. One thing that students need to understand is that Hitler becomes chancellor January 30th of 1933. When does he actually become dictator? Because students assume it's right away, immediately. When does he actually become dictator? Do they know?
Not right away.
Not right away, good. There's two of those good answers you've given.
It's after the burning of the Reichstag.
Okay, but the burning of the Reichstag is only about 4 weeks later. So it's not then.
With the passing of the Enabling Act.
The Enabling Act is actually with the burning of the Reichstag, so that's only a month after. Fall of 34. Until Hindenburg dies in the summer of 34, until Hindenburg dies, the Nazis really can't move all that quickly. But when Hindenburg dies in the fall, actually August of 34, at that point, Hitler abolishes the office of Chancellor and creates abolishes the separate offices of Chancellor and President, and it's really not until the fall of 34. Now that doesn't mean that things aren't happening before 33 and 34, but the dictatorship really isn't established until the fall of 34. Okay, this segment is about a little over 6 minutes long. Hopefully our internet connection is still good.
Dr. Martin.
The ceremonial reopening of Parliament, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, aimed to link the Hitler government to Germany's imperial past and portray the Nazis as saviors of the nation's future. The event was carefully staged to reassure the German establishment, including the military, that Hitler would respect their traditions. Nazi-controlled newsreels then gave the impression that the army supported the new government. Though Hitler walked behind longtime President Hindenburg for now, the new chancellor would soon be Germany's absolute dictator.
The day was dedicated to the new Germany, and more than 100,000 school children stood shoulder to shoulder as the car bearing the aged president and the chancellor proceeded through the crowd to the speaker's stand. Whether you agree with his doctrines or not, it must be admitted that the leadership of Hitler has united the German people for the first time since the war. Their almost fanatical enthusiasm is a marvel to the entire world.
Hindenburg remained president until his death in August 1934. With Hindenburg gone, Hitler, by agreement with the army, abolished the office of president, declaring himself Führer and Reich Chancellor, leader of the nation and head of the government. Now there was no authority above or beside him. Immediately, the armed forces swore an oath of allegiance to Adolf Hitler.
Ich schwöre bei Gott, diesen heiligen Eid, dass ich dem Führer Adolf Hitler unbedingten Gehorsam leiste.
All civil servants, including teachers and police, members of parliament and the judiciary, swore an oath of loyalty, not to any constitution, but to Hitler as Führer of the German nation.
Adolf Hitler.
The economy had reached rock bottom when the Nazis came to power. They boosted its recovery with huge public works projects for the unemployed.
Eine halbe Million erwerbsloser Volksgenossen wurden in diesem Jahr an den Arbeitsplatz zurückgeführt. Seit der Machtübernahme ist die Arbeitslosigkeit um 61 von 100, also um weit über die Hälfte zurückgegangen.
Hitler christened new Autobahns triumphantly in a display of national will that would unite the country and facilitate the secret expansion of Germany's armed forces. In 1935, Germany openly defied the 1919 Treaty of Versailles by reinstituting the draft and increasing its military strength. The Nazis were delivering on their promises to restore and strengthen the nation. Their achievements encouraged many people to overlook radical Nazi policies, or even to support them. In September 1935, the Nazi Party gathered in Nuremberg for its annual rally. It opened with a traditional hymn that added solemnity and a sense of continuity with the past. It ended with a special session of Parliament far from Berlin. New race laws were introduced by Hitler and read by Parliament President Hermann Göring.
Reichsbürger ist nur der Staatsangehörige deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes. Eheschließungen zwischen Juden und Staatsangehörigen deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes sind verboten.
The Nazi regime aimed to create a racially pure Germany, whose so-called superior traits would make it ideally suited to rule the entire European continent. Nazism taught that racial struggle was the driving force in history. Superior races must battle inferior races or be corrupted by them. The Nazi concept of a national community was exclusive and based on race, as defined in the new laws and decrees. Heinrich Himmler and the SS led the ideological battle. Racist ideas were taught in schools. Some groups, such as Jews, Slavs, Blacks, and Roma, also called Gypsies, were labeled racially inferior. People with mental or physical disabilities were designated unworthy of life. Scientists and medical professionals applied pseudo-scientific theories for measuring and valuing racial characteristics.
Same process. Questions, comments, teaching points that you might raise, anything along that line?
What was the tool the doctor was using there at the end to measure?
Is it eye color?
They had like little different colored marbles in there, and he was comparing different eye shades because the idea of the blonde hair, blue eye thing comes into play. I mean, which is in itself very bizarre if you think about it. But what's interesting to know when that happens is the doctors who buy into this are not quacks. I mean, they're legitimate doctors, anthropologists, and so forth and so on, who buy into all this kind of stuff and give a certain sense of legitimacy to them. The head of the Nazi medical in the bureaucracy, Dr. Karl Brandt, was a fairly well-known and fairly well-respected physician medical physician going into all this, and you see this across the board. I mean, the professors, and when 90-some% of the teachers join the teachers union to keep their jobs, all of this gives a sense of legitimacy to everything that's going on. It's not in here, but there are pictures of classrooms, biology classrooms, Josh, of the teachers actually calling Jewish kids up and pointing out their, quote, Jewish characteristics to the rest of the class. This is before Jewish kids are expelled from the schools. Because biology becomes racial science. That's essentially what Aaron and Josh do with their program out at New Haven, is talk about how that idea comes into play, genetics and eugenics and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Well, just to go off of that, I've used some sources in the past where it's not even just biology classes, but just these other classes, and the way they frame the questions are kind of really implying what they want you to learn from this isn't necessarily a math problem, but who's draining society, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's actually, there's a math problem that goes something like this. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it goes something like this. From Berlin to Moscow is X number of kilometers. A plane loaded with bombs uses so many liters of fuel for kilometers, and so many uses, and the same plane without bombs uses how many liters of fuel per kilometer. How many liters of fuel will it take the plane to fly to Moscow and back? Well, the implication is a plane loaded with bombs is going to Moscow and it's coming back without bombs. So what's going to happen when it gets to Moscow? It's going to drop some bombs. I mean, that's actually again, I don't remember the exact numbers, but that's a problem in, I think it was like a 6th or 7th grade sort of pre-algebra math class. There's another one, the same sort of thing, and it's, again, I don't remember the exact numbers. There are so many million people live in Germany. So many people living in Germany are Jews. What percentage of people living in Germany are aliens? Well, there's an implication there. So yeah, it was math. There's a children's book, The Poisonous Mushroom, and it was written for 3rd, 4th graders. And it's a picture book. It's got 20, I think it's 19 or 20 colored pictures. You can find it online. You can actually find the book online. And it's I think it's 18 pictures, 18 little scenarios about Jews. And some of them are religious, some of them are cultural. There's one in there where the very typical German mother and the 2 little German kids, one little blue-eyed, blonde-haired boy and his matching sister, are standing in front of a crucifix. And the mother says, "Don't ever forget the Jews killed Jesus." Now, it's all racial, but that's a convenient sort of add-in to that. It's called The Poisonous Mushroom, Der Giftpilz. And again, the whole thing is online. There are any number of places where you can find the whole book online in the old German script. I forget what it's called, Fractor, I think it's called. You can find the whole book online in translation. So that book was designed for 3rd or 4th grade language arts. So yeah, it's across the board. And it's very, very sophisticated when you think about it.
I was going to say there's a movie called Europa.
Yeah, exactly.
And I like the scene in there where the kid, he ends up, and it's all based on a true story. Yeah. He actually goes into the school, and the professor's sitting there using the calipers to measure his head. Yeah. And he tells him, he goes, you are not as close as an Aryan as this kid, but you are an Aryan through and through. And the whole entire time you realize that the kid's actually Jewish. Yeah. It's pretty interesting.
In one of the pictures in Giftpilz, The Poisonous Mushroom, is a biology class. The professor is very typically Aryan, blonde hair, blue eyed. The boys are, and the little Jewish boy supposedly a Jewish boy is standing at the front, and on the blackboard there is a hooked nose drawn, and the teacher says, "Now remember, Jew's nose looks like the number 8." And then to make sure nobody misunderstands, there's a Star of David written on the blackboard and a very grotesque figure with a big nose drawn on the blackboard in a biology class. And again, the implication here, or not the implication, the thing to remember is this book is written for 3rd and 4th graders. So you can imagine how sophisticated it gets when you get to 14, 15, 16-year-olds. Other things about this segment, okay?
I think it's interesting they introduced the idea of the Nazi ideology of racial warfare, so
Yeah.
you can place it within the larger context of what's going on in Europe. But
Sure.
on the right, you have them arguing racial warfare. On the political left, you have them arguing class warfare.
Yeah.
So it's living in Europe at this time is not a very comfortable existence, regardless of where you are.
Yeah, and let me add something to that, because that's a very important point. Remember what happens after World War I. At the end of the war, you have the Russian revolutions, plural. You have the establishment of the Soviet Union. You have Mussolini coming to power with the March on Rome in 1920, somebody help me, 22. You have the establishment of democratic governments in many places, Poland, for example, and those governments fail very quickly. So you've got the threat of Stalin and Stalinism and the idea of the Comintern, the Communist International. You have all those things going on. There is a very, very active a fascist party in France. There's a very, very active fascist party in England. It's not called fascist, but it's not the Fabians, no. It's a very active fascist party there. You've got all that going on. In the United States, you have Father Coughlin from the political right. You have Huey Long from the political left. So this is a really tumultuous time throughout the Western world. And Germany's right in the center of that. And comes into play. And again, this idea, it's important to note that you have both the political right and the political left threatening democracies. And what essentially happens is the democracies don't have any place to move. If they move right, they run into the fascists. If they move left, they run into the communists. And essentially they get squeezed in different places. Again, this happens in Poland, this happens in Hungary. You have a very right-wing fascist government in Hungary by the mid-1930s, and again in Poland. So I mean, the situation in Germany isn't unique in that regard. It's a very, very tumultuous time. It's a tumultuous time socially. I mean, the Roaring 20s. If we think American society is in upheaval in the 20s, the European societies even, I think it's fair to say, even more so. And we have to. One of the things I do know, the distinction between fascism and Nazism. I've used that a couple of times. Fascism is right-wing political philosophy based on several key ideas: the leader principle, extreme nationalism, extreme extreme militarism, and some control, a substantial control of the economy. Nazism takes those things and adds racism to it. And if you ever look at a textbook, and Patty, I hope you agree with this statement, you being the political scientist here, fascism should be small letter and Nazism should be capital letter. And Nazism should be capital letter for two reasons. Number one, all nouns in German are capitalized. And Carol Jackson, I'm still trying to learn German and doing moderately on it. And also, because Nazism is much more specific. It's fascism plus racism. And it's unique to Germany. I mean, Mussolini kind of gives lip service to some anti-Semitism. He really doesn't allow much to happen with regard to that. So you have to make that distinction. It is really not correct to say that the Nazis were fascist. They're fascist plus. I think that's an important distinction to make. There are no deportations, for example, of Italian Jews so long as Mussolini is in power. It's only after Mussolini is ousted, Germany declares war on Italy, that you have the deportations of Jews from Rome north, I guess it would be. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, would like the fascism in Spain then technically border on Nazism if it brings in a racial element?
No, it's closer to Italian fascism.
Okay.
Yeah. It's very close to it. It's interesting you asked that because I just finished a series of presentations on 20th century Christian heroes. Not heroes, Christian activists at my church, Trinity English Lutheran downtown, and one of the ones I did was Lachambeau. And we got into this, one of the things you have to discuss in that. And what's happening in Spain right now is to a certain extent a third or fourth generation of that, because Catalan, Barcelona was the Republican stronghold, and other parts of Spain were the Falangist Franco stronghold. And really, what's happening there today is almost a replay of that, because Barcelona was I was in Barcelona quite a few years ago, and you know, in Europe you used to have the little bumper stickers with the countries, you know, like D for Germany or F for France. In Barcelona you saw the little bumper decals, E for Spain, with a line slashed through them, because the Catalans don't want to be part of Spain. They just arrested the guy in Belgium or something yesterday, I guess it was. So it's almost a playing out of that kind of deal. But that's fascism, Italian style, not Nazism. Nazi style.
Another thing from the clip would be the mention there of the recovery of the economy in Germany and the use of, you know, if you're making connections in U.S. history, the use of public works,
sure,
kind of, you know, connecting it to the New Deal, I think that's one thing you can do, especially when you're talking about, you know, the rise of extremist governments and how it's connected to how the economy is going. The fact that, you know, other democracies are attempting to solve it so they don't have that problem as well. So.
There was an interesting series, and this is way, way back. If any of you know who Bill Moyers, is he still alive? I don't know if he's still alive or not. But Bill Moyers was LBJ's press secretary, and then he became is he still alive, Frankie? He was LBJ's press secretary, and then he went to work after LBJ left the White House. He went to work as a reporter or a journalist or whatever for PBS. And he created this series, this is way back in the 1970s, called A Walk Through the 20th Century. Have any of you ever heard of it? It's a really neat series. It's black and white and kind of old style now. But anyway, and what he would do, he did this series of programs, there must have been, gosh, several dozen of these, on all kinds of 20th century historical topics. And one of them was called The Democrat and the Dictator, in which he compared and contrasted FDR and Hitler. They come to power in 33, they die in 45, public works, I mean all this. It's a really, really, again, it's way, way dated. You wouldn't want to use it. I don't know, it may not even be available anymore, because it's on a reel-to-reel film. Couldn't even believe that. But it was really interesting because of that very thing. And you do have the extremism in the United States. You have Father Coughlin from the political right, as we mentioned before. You have the America First, which, by the way, Lindbergh was a big supporter of. And then you have Huey Long from the political left. And so the comparison there is the United States has these elements, and the New Deal basically stops those elements. And you don't have those sort of balancing elements in Germany. You don't have that safety valve, I guess, if you want to call it that you have with the New Deal and so forth and so on. Other comments or questions about the thing? There's one that always amazes me here, and that is the American reporter who talks about it. He's how glowing he did. Did any of you catch that? Whether or not you agree with what he says, you have to agree that Hitler has united the German people in no way since the end of the war. I mean, he sounds like a propagandist for Hitler almost. Now, that was an American correspondent in Germany at the time. And I think that's a really interesting take there.
Well, I mean, Hitler was Times Man of the Year in what,
30,
39
yeah, exactly.
or whatever? I mean, in Fort Wayne, in the Rose Garden, Adolf Hitler actually, it was so well known, there's actually a rose bush, the descendant of it's still here, that Hitler himself had sent over. I mean, so there was a big German-American tie.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting to note on that thing with regard to Fort Wayne that back in World War I, up until World War I, the Lutheran churches, the Missouri Synod churches had their services in German. The only language taught at Central High School, which was the only high school at the time, was German. There was a German language paper. And there was a bank called the German American Bank. This is World War I. And it was changed to the Lincoln National Bank. Because who wants to have their money in the German American Bank, and who can be more patriotic than to have your money in the Lincoln National Bank? Now, because Fort Wayne has obviously the big German population. And again, that's a World War I circumstance. But I think that idea of how complimentary that American reporter is to, he says, you may not agree with what he's doing, but you have to agree that he's doing a good job of it. I mean, that's a real implication that comes out of this. There was something called the German American Bund, which was a German American sort of social organization that evolved into a very political organization. They have summer camps for kids, particularly in places like New York and that where you have a lot of Germans. There was a huge rally held in Madison Square Garden in 1935, 1936 by the by the German American Bund. And there's this huge, I mean, they're all in there, they've got swastika armbands on, and this huge picture must be 50 feet high of George Washington behind the podium. Because there was this very strong German allegiance, if you will, to that. In fact, it's interesting that in New York, there's an area on the upper east side of New York at this time around Columbia University, and so many Germans lived there, both Germans and German Jews, that it was referred to as the Fourth Reich. because it's this big center where all the intellectuals of that got. Yeah, Patty.
I was just gonna say, it would be interesting if you could compare that clip from the American Reporter to something reporting on the Spanish Civil War.
That's,
and the difference
that would be very
between,
interesting.
and because I think it helps explain some of the early responses to Hitler, that who was the enemy, not the fascists. The enemies were the communists, even to the Americans.
And I think that's a very important point to note, that remember this is when Stalinism is in vogue in the Soviet Union. There's the idea of the Comintern, the spread of communism. Communism is controlled by Moscow and all those different kinds of things. And to just kind of add to what Patty just said, this is where you get into the whole question of the behavior of the Pope. Help me, Pius the 12th. Pius the 12th, who becomes Pope in 39, help me fellas from Lourdes, Dwigers, 38, 39. Pius the 12th, who becomes Pope in that time, and is Pope until John the 23rd comes along in 1958, had been the papal nuncio, which is sort of like the papal ambassador to Germany. He spoke fluent German, he loved German culture, and he was afraid of communism. So he sees Nazism as a bulwark. He actually uses the term, the Italian term for it, as a bulwark against communism. In other words, we may not like this fellow Hitler, but we should need to have him there to stop Stalin. And this is an idea that kind of permeates a lot of Western thinking, and it leads to a lot of controversy, again, with regard to Pius XII. It's a very, very controversial topic. The whole role of the churches during this period of time is very controversial. As I'm sure all of you know, in Germany there's Catholic and Protestant. Protestant really means Lutheran. Reformation last week, obviously. But there's a tremendous amount of controversy about the role of the churches. The Catholic Church because of Pius XII and what he did and didn't do. The Lutheran Church because it actually splits. There's a pro-Nazi church, the Volksdeutsche Kirche, the German People's Church, and then there's the anti-Nazi confessional church led by Bonhoeffer. And again, this is a very, very controversial kind of topic. And I'll say this because we've got two fellows here from Dwenger and Lures. I used to always think it'd be fun to teach that topic at Dwenger in the morning and Concordia in the afternoon to see which one you got fired from first. Because it's a very tricky topic. That wasn't in here, but that's what happens when you discuss this. That's where you get the discussions that go ways you don't expect. One or two more things, and then we'll take our lunch break here in just a few minutes. Anything else? Yeah.
So when it comes to praising Hitler, I've heard this theory thing where I'm trying to remember because I have a really bad history. I'm really bad at exaggerating things. So I'm trying to be truthful. So I'm trying to like picture all the words. So when it comes to praising him, people say like, yeah, he brought Germany together, so he's a great leader. Or I mean, obviously not a great leader, but he was able to bring them together. I have heard a theory though that since Germany was so broken up that there wasn't much special about Hitler in bringing Germany together, just that any charismatic leader could have kind of revived Germany. So a lot of people I can't remember the articles I read, but they're saying like Hitler shouldn't get any credit because there's nothing special innately about him. It's just that Germany was so destroyed that any powerful leader could have revamped it.
That's an interesting.
Yeah, and my boyfriend's a huge history nerd, so we like debated.
Oh, my condolences.
Oh, yeah.
I've never had that posed. Let me try to just off the cuff. Hitler as an individual, first of all, you have to be careful not to talk about Hitler too much. Because you get in this, Hitler, that kind of thing. So you really have to be careful of that. But talking about him, I mean, he's really a rather unremarkable individual. He was a soldier in World War I, got a couple of, apparently brave, he was wounded, he got some medals and so forth. I mean, he was not a remarkable soldier, but he did his duty and, got the medals. I've been told, and Carol can refer to this more than I, that his German really wasn't all that good. It was kind of guttural or dialectic or whatever, Carol. And I've been told that Mein Kampf is really pretty bad German grammatically and so forth and so on. Because he wasn't German, he was an Austrian. But I think and you always have to be careful the way you say this, I think you have to give Hitler and the Nazis a certain amount of credit in the sense that they were pretty skilled at doing what they wanted to do. For example, when it says in that particular segment that they didn't move until Hindenburg died, they didn't move until Hindenburg died because they knew they couldn't get away with it. But as soon as Hindenburg dies, they combine the office of President Chancellor into the Reichsführer's office and did it very, very... So I think you have to give them a certain credit. Again, you have to be careful the way you say this, for exploiting the situation very, very effectively. Now, could anybody have done that? I don't know. There was a film produced, gosh, a long time ago now, I don't even know if it's even around anymore, called The Fatal Attraction of Adolf Hitler. And it talks about Hitler's personality. And this charisma. Now, when we look at Hitler, we look at it from the idea of historical context, historical time, and the idea of not speaking German or maybe speaking a little German. But when you talk about people who were actually there was I heard a survivor said this, a German Jew who survived the camps said that, I take it back, it was a German, who was not necessarily Nazi. He said after the war, I went to a speech of Hitler's, said there were 10,000 people in this arena or whatever it was. I thought he was speaking directly to me. And you hear that. And the other one that I think is very, very interesting, there's a series that I would highly recommend to you. It was released in the mid-1990s called People's Century. Any of you familiar with it? It's 26 films, you know, it's a really great series. And what the producers of this series did was they went back and they found people who were alive at various times in the 20th century history and interviewed common people, ordinary people. They've actually got a little old lady in there who was 8 years old in St. Petersburg on the day the Tsar was overthrown. And she was like 100 when they interviewed her. So anyway, there's the film in there, and then what they always have is the film will be given a year and a title. 1989 People Power, the fall of communism. They found the guard who opened the gate, sort of by mistake, the gate at Brandenburg. So anyway, the film on the Nazi rise to power is 1933 Master Race. And in this film, toward the end of the film, there is an interview with a gentleman who was a minor British diplomat assigned to the embassy in Berlin early in the Nazi era. I'm sorry, he was actually a British Olympian in 1936 and later became a diplomat. And he said, at the end of the Olympics, all the Olympic athletes were on the floor of the stadium like they always do. The lights went down. The floodlights, the lights went down. The torches came up, and all the Germans started to Heil Hitler. He said, I hated Hitler. He said, I had to put my right hand over my left hand over my right arm to keep my arm from going up. That there was that much attraction with the propaganda and all those kinds of things. If you look out here, one of the books we have is about Nazi propaganda. It's from the museum. I mean, it was powerful. If you look at the films, if you look at the film Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl, the one about the rotating swastika, if you've ever seen that film in black and white, and the rallies were almost always at night because there was this aura about them. That was very, very powerful. So, and they played on that. I was in Nuremberg 2 years ago, December, and went to the documentation center, which is the Nuremberg museum, and then right next to it is the parade grounds where the Nazi rallies were held. The big ones, the Nuremberg rallies. You can actually go and stand on the podium where Hitler stood. I want to tell you folks, it was spooky. I mean, you've got to climb up, it's kind of falling apart now, but it was really kind of weird to be standing there knowing that that's where Hitler observed the rally. I mean, I think you have to say that there was something about this aura that they were able to capture. This idea, I thought he was speaking directly to me. And you'll hear that in any number of different sources, yeah.
Another thing too, I grew up in Germany, so like the whole half of my family was all German.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll admit, they were members of the Nazi Party. My great-grandfather was one of the first 10,000 members. And my grandfather told me that one of the things that attracted him to the Nazi Party was the simple fact that Hitler represented the common man. And his leadership was the fact that he wasn't necessarily brilliant, but he surrounded himself with brilliant individuals. And as such, he knew that he could follow this guy because they knew what they were doing. They were going to be the leaders of the country.
Well, I think, for example, Goebbels, propaganda minister, was a PhD in humanities and literature. Goering was a great World War I hero. There are all these pictures of him of this dashing young man. He's obviously not that later on. Yeah, and in fact, and then we'll break here in just a minute. The three highest, by percentage of population, the three highest occupations membership in the SS, by percentage. Fran's nodding here. She knows where I'm going with this. We're what? Doctors. Yeah, doctors, lawyers, and teachers. Yeah, the teaching. Those are the three highest, by percentage of population, the three highest professions represented in the SS. Doctors are supposed to do no harm, lawyers are supposed to protect your rights, and teachers are supposed to pass on the values of society. And those are the three highest represented occupations in the SS.
And it's a great question to ask your students, that civil servants thing, like,
Yeah.
and they find out real quick how they buy into you,
Yeah.
like, and they do anything you say in the classroom, like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And they do that. And then about the leadership thing, like, if you look at the challenge, the 5 leadership in the leadership challenge by Kozebs and Posner, their 5 are like inspire, shared vision, model way, challenge the process, those kind of things. And he did all of those, like, wonderfully. Just had bad intentions in the end.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word wonderfully, but I would use the word effectively. I think you have to acknowledge that. I really think you have to acknowledge that. Were the Nazis opportunists? Sure. Were they effective opportunists? Yes. Were there all kinds of red flags? Yes. One of the ways I like to explain it is, and I think one of the articles in there that I wrote is about just a general historical overview. The Nazis essentially said, give us power and we'll give you a job. They did. They went from very high rates of unemployment to virtually no unemployment in a very short period of time because of the armaments. They restored German pride. That was the whole thing about the Olympics, was restoring German pride. You can still go to the Olympic Stadium in Berlin. It's just a huge kind of thing. So all those things were part and parcel of this. Okay, what we're going to do now is a very different thing. I've asked Betsy a minute ago. Betsy Gephardt. There she is. We're going to do a big thing for just a few minutes, then we're going to have lunch. So Betsy, if you want to come down. This is Betsy Gephardt. Where she went, I just saw her a minute ago.
David, lunch is there too.
And we're Betsy, and then we'll go. Betsy is a violinist with the Fort Wayne Philharmonic, and she is also in charge of the library section of the Resource Center here, which just opened in May. And so she's going to take just a few minutes to just give you a general overview of the center and particularly some of the resources that are available. So, Betsy.
Okay. I don't know whether you got the handout that I had sent to Bonnie or not. I have some copies here. I don't think I printed enough because I didn't know how many people were going to be here. But if you didn't, I'll just have you pass that on. It's a small sampling of what we have here in the library. Our Resource Center library is open for browsing anytime for anybody. Anytime this building is open, you can come in and browse it. To borrow materials, members of the 2 Jewish congregations in the Federation are able to access those for free. If anybody else is welcome to, we have a one-time $10 fee to get borrowing privileges, so we can borrow stuff if you come in and show us your driver's license and all that kind of stuff. You're welcome to look. We have a pretty large collection of Holocaust-related materials. Everything from DVDs to movies and a lot of books. A pretty decent collection of teen fiction and nonfiction and adult fiction. I have some of the stuff out on display, and you're welcome to look there after this if you want to. All of our books that have any kind of Holocaust material in them have a little star symbol on them, so they're pretty easy to find. We have some materials that aren't available downtown. I think what is kind of most useful for this library, it's not a huge collection, but it may be easier to just browse it than a big, huge one. So, like I said, if you're interested, you're welcome to come in anytime this building is open. We have a catalog available online and a computer to access that behind the desk, and that's on all the time. If anybody has any questions, I'm certainly happy to answer.
Betsy, we would be able to open the door to the
Yeah, it's open right now. I just opened it. And if you have the magic key, you can open it. So yeah, a lot of our collection is in storage. So if you come in when there's not staff here, you might have to ask to get into the storage area. But my email address is also on that sheet. And I'm happy to pull something for you if you find something in the catalog you want to look at on any given day. You can arrange something. I'm happy to help whenever I can. But we don't have a lot of staffed hours because I'm kind of the staff. So that's, but you're welcome to come in.
Thank you, Betsy. We're going to go to lunch here in just a minute, but before we do that, I wanted to introduce a guest here with us who's going to just spend some time talking to you as we're eating. Irv, you want to? Irv? This is Irv Adler.
Oh, I'm on now? Okay.
You're going to be on here as soon as we get the food. As soon as we get lunch, you're going to be on, Irv, during lunch.
You want me to start now, or you want everybody to get
we'll start after they get their lunch.
Okay. So I eat first?
Huh?
Okay.
To give you a little background on this, and then Irv and Fran can fill this in.
I'm going to pull this out, okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Several years ago, I've known Irv and Fran for a long time. Irv told me about some letters he had from family in Austria before and during the war. And he asked me if I knew anybody who could do some translating, and there was a young lady who was in our program at IPFW at that time, Joy Yushin, who's now teaching in Annapolis, did some translating of these letters for Irv, and then Irv is having more of them done. These are letters coming from his family in Austria during the war, and we got into a really big thing. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have you go get your lunch, and then come back, and then while you're having lunch, Irv will just kind of run through this. It's a very, very interesting project. It's just kind of, I think Irv gotten a lot bigger than you ever thought as it began. And getting bigger, they've been over there, Irv and Fran have been over there to Austria several times and made some contacts there. So I think you'll find it interesting. So go at lunch, and then come back, and then we'll go from there, okay? Thank you.
Wait.
I'm sorry, Betsy, go ahead.
She actually wanted me to announce something that I was not aware of, but she wanted me to point out that $10 fee that I just mentioned, the Federation will cover for you guys as you are educators. So don't let that stop you. Still need to come and see me to get a library card, but
Thanks,
with the $10.
So go have lunch, everybody, and then come back, and while we're having lunch, Irv is just going to talk about this very, very interesting project.
But it's okay.